The stagecoach was 40 minutes late. Ryder Blackwell knew this because he had been standing in the same spot outside the Willow Ridge station since 4:15, watching the horizon. The way a man watches something he's not entirely sure he wants to see coming. The sun was dropping fast behind the Laramie Range, painting the sky in shades of burnt orange and deep bruised purple. And the October wind had teeth in it, the kind that found every gap in your coat collar and stayed there. He hadn't told anyone he was coming to meet the stagecoach. He hadn't needed to. Willow Ridge had maybe 300 souls on a generous count, and in a town that size, news didn't travel, it leaked. By the time Ryder had ridden in from the ranch that afternoon, half the main street already knew that the Blackwell man had sent away for a bride and that she was arriving today. He could feel the awareness of it on him like a second coat. Folks finding reasons to linger near the general store, women stepping onto porch boards they hadn't swept in weeks. Old Hector Mills pretending to fix something on his wagon wheel for the fourth time in an hour. Ryder didn't look at any of them directly. He kept his eyes on the road. He was 34 years old, and he had learned a long time ago that looking directly at things people expected you to be embarrassed about only made it worse. The Blackwell Ranch sat 12 miles northeast of town, tucked into a shallow valley where the creek bent hard left before straightening toward open grazing land. His father had broken that ground. His older brother Marcus had worked it beside him for 11 years before a horse threw him and broke something in his spine that never healed right, and Marcus moved his family to Cheyenne, where the ground was flatter in every sense of the word. That left Ryder. Just Ryder. 340 acres, a decent cattle operation, 2 ranch hands he trusted, and a house that had been quiet for so long he'd stopped noticing the sound of his own boots on the floor. He'd placed the advertisement in a Philadelphia paper in July. He wasn't proud of it, but he wasn't ashamed either. He needed a partner. The ranch needed more than one set of hands making decisions. The winters out here had a way of breaking a person down to their core, and Ryder had begun to feel, somewhere around his third winter alone, that he was losing pieces of himself to the cold in ways that had nothing to do with temperature. He'd received 11 letters. He'd written back to 3. Only Evelyn Hart had kept writing. Her letters were careful. Not flowery. He'd have stopped reading at the first flower, but measured and honest in a way that felt like she was choosing each word after some consideration of whether she meant it. She told him she was 29, a school teacher by training, and that she wanted to be truthful about one thing up front. She was not coming west looking for romance. She was coming west looking for a chance to begin again. She hoped that was enough for him to work with. He'd written back that it was. What she hadn't told him, what he would only learn in pieces, over hours and days, was why she needed to begin again in the first place. The stagecoach came around the eastern bend with a sound like distant thunder, 4 horses working hard, the driver pulling them back as they hit the decline into town. Ryder straightened his coat. He was not a man who straightened coats as a rule, but he found himself doing it anyway, and then felt immediately irritated with himself for doing it. The coach rolled to a stop in front of the station. Hector Mills stopped pretending to fix his wagon wheel. The station agent, a round-faced man named Dobbins, came out wiping his hands on a rag, squinting at the coach like he was expecting something of interest. 3 passengers climbed out. A traveling merchant with a sample case. A heavy-set man in a suit who looked like he'd been sick for most of the journey. And then a woman. Ryder saw her before the crowd did, because he was closest and because he was looking for her, but even so, it took him a half-second to make sense of what he was seeing. She was tall. Taller than he'd expected, though he couldn't have said why he'd expected anything. Dark hair, mostly pinned up but coming loose on one side in a way that suggested the journey had been long. A green traveling dress that might have been decent quality once but had taken some hard miles. A single trunk being lowered from the coach's roof. She stood on the ground with one hand on the coach door for a moment, just one moment. And in that moment Ryder saw her face clearly. Her eyes were red. Not just tired red. She had been crying, recently, and probably not for the first time today. And she was doing her best to compose herself in the 8 seconds between stepping off the coach and having to face whoever was waiting for her. Her best wasn't quite good enough. The sob that escaped her was small. She pressed her lips together immediately, got it controlled, lifted her chin. But the damage was done. The thing had gotten out, and now every person on that porch had seen it. Someone in the small crowd made a sound. A woman's murmur, sympathetic or judgmental. It was hard to say. Hector Mills leaned toward his wife and said something Ryder couldn't hear. Ryder walked forward. He didn't run, and he didn't stop to think about it, because thinking about it would have slowed him down. He crossed the 15 feet of packed dirt between them and stopped in front of her, close enough that he was between her and most of the town's line of sight. She looked up at him. Her eyes, brown, he registered, dark brown, with that redness around the edges, went wide for a second with something that might have been fear. "Miss Hart," he said. His voice came out low. Normal. Like he was talking to a person, not a situation. "I'm Ryder Blackwell." She opened her mouth, closed it, tried again. "Mr. Blackwell." Her voice was steadier than her face. I apologize. I'm not." She stopped, pressed her fingers briefly to her lips. "I'm sorry. This isn't the arrival I intended." "No need for sorry," he said. "I'm not usually like this." "All right. I want you to know that." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Is that your trunk?" She blinked. "Yes." "I'll get it." He turned to the station agent. "Dobbins, grab the other end." And that was how it started. Not with ceremony or formal greeting or the awkward half handshake, half something else that he'd been dreading on the ride into town. He picked up the trunk, Dobbins took the other handle, and Evelyn Hart followed them to where his wagon was tied, and behind them the small crowd of Willow Ridge slowly returned to its business with enough to talk about for the next several weeks. He gave her the bench seat of the wagon, which he never used, preferring to ride alongside in the saddle. But today he tied his horse to the back and climbed up beside her, because the road out to the ranch was long, and she was clearly in no condition to be left alone with the dark coming on. They rode in silence for a while, the kind of silence that isn't comfortable but isn't hostile either. It's just two people trying to locate themselves in a situation neither of them had fully prepared for. She had a handkerchief out. She used it twice, carefully, without making a production of it. The prairie opened up around them as they left town, wide and darkening, the grasses bending in the wind. In the distance, a line of cottonwoods marked where the creek ran. The stars were beginning to show. "You don't have to be careful with me," she said finally. He glanced at her. "I'm not being careful." "You haven't asked." "Asked what?" She turned to look at him directly. There was something challenging in it, but not mean. More like someone testing whether the ice holds before they put their full weight on it. "Why I was crying. Everyone else wanted to." Ryder thought about this. "Figured you'd tell me if you wanted to. And if I didn't want to? Then it's your business." A pause. The wagon wheels turned on the rutted road. An owl called somewhere in the dark to the left of them. "I'm going to tell you," she said, "because you have a right to know what you're getting, but I want you to understand that I don't want pity. I want to be very clear about that." "Understood." She folded the handkerchief in her lap. Precise, deliberate. When she spoke, her voice had changed. The waver was gone, replaced by something flat and careful, the voice of someone who has told a hard story enough times to have found the shortest route through it. "I was a school teacher in Philadelphia," she said. "I had a position at a private academy for 6 years. I was good at it. I know that sounds like boasting, but I need you to understand what I had before I can explain what happened to it." "Go on." "The headmaster of the school, a man named Caldwell, made certain advances toward me. Over a period of about 2 years, I rejected them. Consistently, carefully, and, I thought, without causing the kind of scene that would bring trouble down on either of us." She paused. "I was wrong about that last part." Ryder kept his eyes on the road. The horses knew this stretch well enough. "When I rejected him a final time, clearly, this past spring, he went to the school's board of directors. He told them I had been conducting myself inappropriately with students' fathers. He said there were complaints. He said—" She stopped, cleared her throat. "He was very specific, and he was convincing because men like him are always convincing to other men like them. The air between them was very still. I was dismissed without a hearing. My teaching certificate was suspended pending review, a review controlled by men who knew Caldwell and owed him favors. Word traveled. It always does in a city, same as a small town, just faster and wider. Within 6 weeks, I couldn't find respectable work in Philadelphia, couldn't find it in Harrisburg. I have a cousin in Connecticut who offered me a room for charity, and—" She stopped again. Something moved across her face that she stopped before it could develop. "I'd rather starve than take charity from someone who's always wanted the chance to give it to me." Ryder said nothing. He was listening in the way he had, the way that some men mistake for disinterest. But it wasn't. He was simply a man who believed that listening and talking at the same time was not actually listening. "I saw your advertisement," Evelyn said. "I saw several, but yours was the only one that didn't read like a livestock posting." A short sound escaped her. Not quite a laugh, but in the neighborhood of one. "Most of them wanted to know my age and my teeth and whether I could cook. Yours asked if I could work hard and be honest. That's what I needed to know. I know." She looked out at the dark prairie. "I answered because I thought, the West doesn't know Caldwell. The West doesn't know any of it. I could come somewhere that didn't already have a verdict on me." A long silence. "Did I make a mistake?" she asked. It came out quieter than the rest, more real, less recited. "Coming here. I need to know now, before we're any further in, whether I've made a mistake." Ryder pulled the horses to a slow stop on the dark road. Not because he needed to. The horses didn't need guidance here, but because some things needed to be said without the distraction of moving forward. He turned to look at her. "What Caldwell did," he said. "That's got nothing to do with what happens here." She studied his face, looking for the lie in it, or the hesitation, or the performance. "You believe me?" "Yes." "You don't know me?" "No. But I know the shape of what you're describing, and I know the kind of man who does it." He paused. "I believe you." She looked at him for a long moment, then she turned back to face the road ahead, and she did something he didn't expect. She straightened in her seat, a slight adjustment, like something inside her shifted fractionally back into place. "All right," she said quietly. "All right." He flicked the reins, and the horses moved on. The ranch house appeared out of the dark about 40 minutes later, a long, low structure with a covered porch along the front, light burning in 2 windows. Not grand, not a ruin either. Solid was the word for it, the kind of building that meant to be there. Ryder's 2 ranch hands, Pete Daniels, and a younger man, everyone called Cobb, had apparently been expecting them. The barn doors were open, and both men materialized in the lantern light with the carefully casual air of people who have been told not to stare but have entirely forgotten the instruction. "Evening," Pete said. He was 60, leathery, had worked for Ryder's father before Ryder was born. He looked at Evelyn with an expression that was mostly neutral and a little bit cautious. "Evening," Evelyn said. Her voice was steady now. "I'm Evelyn Hart. I apologize for arriving so late. The stage was delayed outside of Laramie." "No trouble," Pete said. He meant it, Ryder could tell. Pete was a man of limited words and no false ones. Cobb, 18, tall, red-haired, with the particular speechlessness of a young man in the presence of an unfamiliar woman, managed a nod that involved his whole upper body. "I'll take the horses," Pete said. "Cobb, get the trunk." Inside, the house was warmer than the night air. A fire burned in the main room's stone hearth. It was a working man's house. No extra furniture, no decorative touches, everything chosen for function and left where it was most useful. It smelled like wood smoke and leather, and something that had been cooked earlier. Ryder watched Evelyn look around the room. He found he couldn't read her face right then. "It's not much," he said. "It's real," she said. The way she said it made him think she hadn't been somewhere that felt real in a while. "There's a room." He gestured toward the short hallway. "It was my brother's. It's got a door with a lock. I want to be clear about that. There's a lock, and I'll give you the key tonight." She turned to look at him. "Mr. Blackwell?" "Ryder." A pause. "Ryder. We barely know each other." "Right, which is why I want to be clear there's a lock." Something shifted in her expression. It wasn't gratitude, or it wasn't only gratitude. It was closer to the look of someone recalculating a situation they thought they had fully estimated. "Thank you," she said, simply, without the waterworks. "There's stew left from earlier, probably still warm. I'll find you a bowl." He went into the kitchen, and he heard her behind him, not going to the chair he'd expected, but moving to stand by the window instead, looking out at the dark yard. "Your land," she said. "How much?" $340. Good grazing. Water from the creek doesn't run dry, even in drought years." "Cattle?" 112 head right now. Been higher, been lower. Market's decent this year. "Do you have debt on the property?" He glanced back at her. It was an unusually direct question. Most people circled debt like it was a sick animal. "Some. Not dangerous. The north pasture fence needs replacing. That's the next big cost. What does that run? 300 give or take. If we do the labor ourselves, half that. She nodded slowly, absorbing it. You're not uncomfortable talking about it. About what? Money. The numbers. Men usually are, when it's a woman asking. Ryder set the stew bowl on the table and looked at her. You asked a practical question. I gave you a practical answer. Why would I be uncomfortable? Evelyn Hart looked at him across the small kitchen for a long moment. Then she came to the table and sat down. Most men I've known, she said carefully, treat women having opinions about money the same way they treat a dog trying to read. Mildly amusing, slightly unsettling. Ryder sat across from her. That's a waste of information. Yes, she said. It is. She picked up the spoon. She ate. He watched her eat not with surveillance, but with the simple awareness of someone trying to learn the shape of a person he didn't yet know. She held herself carefully, not stiffly. She wasn't performing propriety, but with the economical posture of someone who had learned not to take up more space than necessary. He thought about the story she'd told him on the road, the careful way she'd laid it out, the single moment where the voice had gone quiet and small. Did I make a mistake? And the way she'd stitched herself back together before he'd finished answering. She was not fragile. She was damaged, which was completely different. The preacher comes through on Saturdays, he said. Every other week. Next one's in 10 days. She kept eating. That gives us 10 days to determine whether this is a mistake, or to determine it isn't. She looked up. You're that confident? I'm not confident about anything, he said. But 10 days is enough time to find out what we need to find out. She considered this. Then she went back to her stew. I want to be useful, she said. I want to pull weight. I don't want to be an arrangement that one person carries. Good, Ryder said, because I can't afford one of those. Another almost laugh. It was a better sound than the sob outside the station. Okay. He showed her the room after she'd eaten. It was small, a narrow bed, a chest of drawers Marcus had left, a window facing east. He'd put fresh blankets on it 3 days ago, and then felt stupid about it, and then left them on anyway. He gave her the key from the mantel where he'd left it. She held it for a moment, turning it over in her fingers. Ryder, she said. Yeah. What I told you. About Caldwell, about Philadelphia. I'd prefer it didn't go further. It won't. People will ask. People always ask, doesn't mean I have to answer. He met her eyes. You decided what your story is here. That's yours to make. She stood in the doorway of the small room with the key in her hand and something on her face that he didn't have a name for yet. Some compound of relief and calculation and the guarded beginning of something that wasn't trust, but was perhaps the prerequisite for it. Good night, Ryder Blackwell, she said. Good night, Miss Hart. Evelyn, she said, and closed the door. He stood in the hallway for a moment in the dark. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods along the creek. The fire in the main room ticked and popped. Somewhere in the upper pasture, one of the cattle made a low sound and went quiet. He walked back to the main room and sat in his chair by the fire and looked at the flames for a long time. He had expected many things from this arrangement. He had not expected to feel, by the end of the first night, that he had met someone worth knowing. The next morning arrived hard and cold, the way October mornings did in Wyoming, with frost on the window panes and breath visible in the air before the fire was properly built up. Ryder was already in the kitchen when he heard movement in the hallway. Not quiet, tentative movement, but purposeful, the sound of boots. Evelyn came into the kitchen already dressed, hair pinned, coat on. He looked at her. I thought I'd see about the chickens, she said. Pete told me last night where the coop was. Pete told you? We talked for a few minutes before I turned in. He's not unfriendly. He's just economical. Ryder looked at her for a moment longer. He's been economical with new people for 40 years. He talked to you voluntarily? I asked him about the water situation, and he apparently has opinions about the creek's South Fork. Something moved in her face. The ghost of actual amusement. Very strong opinions. Ryder turned back to the stove. He didn't say anything, but something in his chest did something that it hadn't done in a while. Something that wasn't discomfort or relief, or the quiet grinding responsibility of keeping the ranch alive. It was something lighter than all of that. He poured 2 cups of coffee. He set one at the end of the table nearest the door. She looked at it, and at him, and then she sat down and wrapped both hands around it, and they existed in the morning quiet without needing to fill it, two people beginning to learn the distance between strangers and something else. Outside, the frost caught the early sun and burned silver across the fields, and the cattle stirred in the lower pasture, and the creek ran south toward Willow Ridge, carrying clean cold water down from the mountains. The day had started. There was work to do. They both knew it, and they both rose to meet it, side by side, not yet at ease, not yet certain, but no longer afraid of what the other person was going to cost them. That was enough for now. The woman who arrived in pieces was already beginning, quietly and stubbornly, to put herself back together. She didn't know yet that the ranch, and the man who ran it, was going to need her whole. And Ryder Blackwell, standing in his kitchen with a second coffee cup on the table for the first time in years, didn't yet understand that what he thought he'd sent for, a partner in survival, was something considerably more complicated than that. But neither of them had run. And in Wyoming in 1883, that counted for a great deal. The first week passed the way hard weeks do. Not slowly, not quickly, but in layers, each day adding something new on top of whatever the day before had left behind. Evelyn learned the rhythm of the ranch the way she had always learned things, by watching first, then doing, then adjusting. She was not a woman who asked permission before attempting something. She was a woman who attempted it and then dealt with the consequences. Ryder noticed this on the second morning, when he came around the corner of the barn and found her already halfway through repairing a split section of the chicken coop fence with pieces of scrap wood she'd located herself without asking anyone where they were kept. She wasn't doing it right, technically. The angle of the boards was off, and they'd need to be repositioned or the whole repair would loosen in a week. He stood there for a moment, calculating the particular awkwardness of correcting someone who was already giving their honest effort. "Angle's wrong," he said finally. She stopped, looked at the fence, looked at him. "Show me." No defensiveness, no embarrassment, just the flat, pragmatic request of someone who wanted the correct information. He showed her. She watched carefully, made the adjustment, and finished the section herself. He went back to what he'd been doing. They didn't discuss it further. He was beginning to understand, the way she operated. She didn't waste energy on pride when there was a more practical option available. Pete, who trusted no one quickly and had made an art form out of skepticism, was watching her too. Ryder could tell by the way the old man's silences had shifted. There was a difference between Pete being quiet because he had nothing to say, and Pete being quiet because he was processing something. By the third day, Pete was quietly processing Evelyn Hart. Cobb, the younger hand, had solved his speechlessness problem by apparently deciding that the best approach was to be in a different part of the property whenever Evelyn was nearby. She seemed to find this funny in a private way she didn't share with anyone. The town was a different matter. Ryder went into Willow Ridge on the Thursday of that first week for feed and supplies, and he felt the particular temperature of a small town that has recently acquired a subject of interest. Margaret Holt, who ran the dry goods store with her husband and functioned as a kind of unofficial clearinghouse for all local information, asked him 3 separate questions about Evelyn in the space of selling him 20 pounds of oat feed, each question dressed up as something else, each one a probe looking for the wound. How was Miss Hart settling in? Had she found the climate agreeable? Did she have family back east who'd be worried about her? Ryder answered each one with the minimum truthful content available. Fine. Hard to say yet. Don't know. Margaret Holt's expression each time was the particular expression of a woman who suspects she is receiving edited information but cannot prove it. He rode home carrying the feeling that Willow Ridge had already started building an opinion about Evelyn Hart, and that they were building it out of whatever materials they had at hand, which, given that they knew almost nothing real about her, meant they were building it out of what they'd seen at the station. A woman arriving in tears. A woman who looked, to a certain type of eye, like someone carrying a secret. I didn't say any of this to Evelyn. He wasn't sure yet how she'd receive it, and he was still learning the map of her, where the solid ground was, where the soft spots were, where you had to step with some care. What he didn't know was that Evelyn was already aware of it. She knew the mechanics of small-town judgment, the same way she knew the mechanics of every social system she'd ever had to navigate, from the inside out, with the particular clarity of someone who has been its subject before. She had felt it in Philadelphia before the walls came down. She recognized the shape of scrutiny even from 12 miles away. What she was deciding, quietly, in the evenings when the ranch work was done and she sat at the small table in the main room with one of the 3 books she'd managed to bring west, was how much of her energy to spend worrying about it and how much to spend on things she could actually control. Most evenings, she concluded, not much. Not yet. She had other things to figure out first. On the fifth night, it rained. Not the polite kind of rain that eases in and minds itself, the Wyoming kind, which arrives without ceremony and immediately makes clear that the land belongs to it and not the other way around. By 8 in the evening, the creek was running high, and by 9, Ryder was in his boots and coat checking the lower fence line because the south pasture had a section that went soft in high water. Evelyn was already up when he came back in at 10:30, soaked through and carrying a length of broken fence post that had needed replacing before it floated downstream and took a section of wire with it. She looked at him, at the post, at the puddle forming on the floor from his coat. She went to the kitchen without a word and came back with a towel and a mug of something hot. Not coffee, it turned out, but some kind of tea she'd found in a tin on the upper shelf that Ryder hadn't touched in 2 years because his mother had left it there and he hadn't been sure what to do with it. He took the towel. He took the mug. He sat in the chair by the fire, feeling the kind of tired that gets into your shoulders and stays there. South fence? She asked. Yeah, lost about 8 feet of post. Water took it before I got there. Can it wait till morning? Has to. Can't work it in the dark. He drank the tea, which tasted like something that had been dried a long time ago, but was still doing its job. Cattle are on higher ground. They'll be fine. She sat across from him in the other chair, the one she'd started using in the evenings, the one that had been nobody's chair before because there'd been no one to fill it. She had her book closed in her lap. She'd been reading before he came in, and the lamp was still lit. You do this alone every time it rains? She said. Usually. Pete and Cobb don't. Pete's got a bad knee. It swells in wet weather. And Cobb's good help, but he's 18 and he sleeps like the dead. Ryder looked at the fire. It's always been me for the night work. You learn to manage. She was quiet for a moment. Then, I can do night checks. He glanced at her. I'm not sleeping well anyway, she said. It came out matter of fact, not asking for anything. I haven't since I left Philadelphia. If there's going to be someone up, it should be useful. It's not safe work after dark, in the rain. I didn't say I'd do it alone. I said I could do it. She looked at him directly. There's a difference. He held her gaze for a moment. She did not look away, which he was starting to understand was just her default. Not defiance, just the straightforward attention of someone who had decided looking directly at things was more efficient than looking around them. All right, he said. Good. She opened her book again. He went back to looking at the fire, the mug warm in his hands, the rain making its racket on the roof. The house felt less quiet than it had a week ago. He wasn't sure yet if that was a relief or a complication. He suspected, in the way that he suspected most things that mattered, that it was both. She met Nora Calloway on the Saturday of the second week, when Ryder drove her into Willow Ridge for supplies. She'd determined the house needed. A list she'd made herself on a piece of brown paper in handwriting so small and precise it looked like something printed. Nora Calloway was 36, a widow, ran a small millinery out of the front room of her house on the north end of the main street. She had opinions about most things, and the confidence to distribute them freely, and she had been, Ryder had mentioned once without elaborating, one of his late mother's only real friends in town. She came out of her shop as Evelyn was crossing toward the dry goods, and instead of the careful, searching hello of Margaret Holt's variety, Nora said, You're the one Ryder finally went and sent for. Good. That man has been running that ranch into the ground on stubbornness for 3 years. Evelyn stopped. I'm Evelyn Hart. I know who you are. I'm Nora Calloway. She looked Evelyn over with the frank appraisal of a woman who was not pretending to be polite about it. You look like you've had a harder time than you're letting on. Most people do, Evelyn said. Nora laughed, a real laugh, short and genuine. Fair enough. Come in for a minute. I've got coffee on and the good stuff isn't out on the shelf. Evelyn had not been expecting an ally. She had calibrated herself for the Margaret Holt variety of Willow Ridge, probing, slightly suspicious, performing warmth while hunting for information. Nora Calloway was something different, and for a moment Evelyn felt the internal adjustment required when reality doesn't match your preparation. She went in. The shop was small and warm and cluttered in a way that felt intentional. Shelves of hat forms and ribbon and fabric scraps arranged in a system that probably made sense only to its owner. 2 chairs near the window with a small table between them. Coffee in mismatched cups. Margaret Holt will have told you everyone's business by now, Nora said, settling into her chair with the comfort of a woman in her own territory. I haven't spoken to her much. Smart. She's not unkind, but she keeps a ledger. Nora sipped her coffee. What she's been telling people is that you arrived looking distressed, which is technically true and completely useless as information. Evelyn kept her expression neutral. What have people made of it? A few things, none of them particularly original. Nora set down her cup. Ruth Granger thinks you're running from a husband back east. Old Miller thinks Ryder got swindled. Most people are just curious because it's October and there's nothing else going on. And what do you think? Nora looked at her for a moment. I think you're a woman who had something go badly wrong and made a decision to try something else. And I think you've got enough spine to make it work if the town doesn't eat you alive first. She paused. Also, I think you're sizing me up right now to determine whether I'm safe to talk to. Yes, Evelyn said simply. Good answer. Nora picked up her cup again. I'm as safe as anyone gets out here, which means I keep what's important and share what doesn't matter. You'll have to decide which is which. It was the most honest contract Evelyn had been offered in a year. She thought about it for 10 seconds, and then she made a decision. Not to tell Nora everything, but to stop performing the version of herself she'd been wearing like armor since she left Philadelphia. The man who destroyed my reputation back east, she said. He still could. If his name reaches here, if the story reaches here before I've built anything, it would follow me even across all of this. She gestured vaguely toward the window, toward the open prairie beyond it. Nora was quiet for a moment. Does Ryder know? He knows. And? He said it was my business, my story to tell or not tell. Nora looked at her with an expression that Evelyn couldn't immediately categorize. Did he now? It wasn't a question. It was the sound of a woman filing something away. All right, then here's what I'll tell you about this town. Most of what they decide about a person, they decide in the first 6 weeks. After that, they mostly leave you alone unless you give them a reason not to. She leaned forward slightly. The question is what they decide, which depends on what they see, which depends on what you do. Nora sat back. So what are you going to do, Evelyn Hart? Evelyn drank her coffee. It was good, strong, no bitterness. Someone who knew what they were doing had made it. Work, she said. I'm going to work. Nora smiled. It was not a polished or reassuring smile. It was the smile of someone who recognized an answer that had been meant. The conversation in town that neither of them was present for happened 2 days later, in the back of the feed store, between a man named Douglas Farrow and the owner, Walt Greer. Farrow was the largest landowner in the valley, 800 acres to Ryder's 340, a cattle operation that had been profitable enough for long enough that he'd mistaken prosperity for superiority. He was 52, well-dressed by frontier standards, a widower who had spent the last several years behaving as though being the biggest dog in a small territory was a fixed condition rather than a circumstance. He had also, some years back, made an offer on a piece of Ryder's land, the North Pasture, the one with the creek access, and Ryder had refused it. Flatly, without extended negotiation, in the way that made clear the refusal was not a starting position, but a final one. Farrow had not forgotten this. Walt Greer told Ryder about the conversation 2 days after it happened, because Walt was the kind of man who believed people had a right to know when their names were being used as subject matter. Farrow was asking about her, Walt said, handing Ryder his receipt over the counter. About where she came from, whether anyone knew anything specific. Ryder folded the receipt and put it in his coat. What'd you tell him? Told him I didn't know and didn't see that it was relevant to anything. Walt looked at him steadily. Thought you should know he was asking. Yeah. Ryder looked at the counter for a moment. Thanks, Walt. He rode home with it sitting in his chest like a piece of flint. Small, not immediately dangerous, but the kind of thing that makes itself known when you move wrong, he told Evelyn that evening. He didn't dress it up or try to soften it into something easier to hear. He sat across from her at the kitchen table and told her what Walt had said, and he watched her face go through something that started as careful neutrality and ended somewhere a little harder. Farrow, she said, tell me about him. Biggest rancher in the valley, has about twice my land, roughly 3 times my cattle, holds a lot of informal influence here. People owe him favors or money or both. He's not a violent man, but he's... Ryder thought about the right word. Persistent. When he wants something, he keeps at it from different angles until he either gets it or convinces himself he never really wanted it. And he wants something from you. North Pasture Has for a few years. I won't sell. Evelyn was quiet. Her hands were on the table, still. So he's asking about me because he thinks that whatever I'm running from is something he can use. That's my read. Can he find anything? Ryder met her eyes. Depends on how hard he looks and who he knows back east. Caldwell's not a private man. The story he told about you, he told to people. Someone willing to write letters and wait for answers could probably find a version of it. She absorbed this. She didn't flinch, but something in her jaw tightened. When would we know? When Pharaoh uses it, or when word gets to Margaret Holt, whichever comes first. A silence. Outside, the wind moved through the dry grass. It had cleared after the rain, and the nights now were very cold and very still, with the particular emptiness of High Plains autumn. Then I need to be established here before he finds anything, Evelyn said. Whatever I'm going to do in this town, I need to do it faster than he can dig. What are you going to do? She looked at him. Is there a school? He shook his head. Never has been. Children ride into Laramie when families can manage it, which isn't often. Most of the younger kids here haven't had proper schooling. Something came into her face. Not dramatic, not a visible light bulb moment. It was subtler than that. It was the look of a woman who has just located the intersection of what she needs and what she has to give. Who do I talk to about that? Town council, such as it is. 3 men, Walt Greer, the preacher Morrison, and Pharaoh. She went quiet again at that last name. Pharaoh's one of 3, Ryder said. He doesn't have a veto. No, she said, but he has influence. He does. They sat with that for a moment. I'd rather do it right than do it fast, she said finally. If I go to them too soon, before I've got any standing here, Pharaoh could kill it with a word. She thought for another moment. I need people on my side first. People he can't easily dismiss. Nora Calloway. Already started there. Evelyn looked at him. I need someone else. Someone whose opinion the men on that council respect. Pete, Ryder said. He said it before he'd finished thinking it through, but once he said it, it was obviously right. Pete's been in this valley for 40 years. His opinion carries weight in ways mine doesn't because mine comes with self-interest attached. His doesn't. Does he think well enough of me yet? Ryder considered this honestly. He thinks you're competent and you don't complain about work. For Pete, that's most of it. What's the rest of it? He needs to decide you're honest. She nodded slowly. How does he decide that? With Pete? He just watches. You can't rush it. Ryder looked at her. But I think you're closer than you know. She turned that over. Then she stood, clearing the cups from the table, a habit she'd fallen into without comment, the same way she'd fallen into making the morning coffee before he was up, small voluntary contributions to the shared machinery of the household. Ryder, she said, her back to him, at the kitchen basin. Yeah. Thank you for telling me about Pharaoh. You didn't have to. Yes, I did. She turned around. Most men wouldn't have. Most men aren't in a partnership. He said it simply, like it was obvious, because to him it was. They had agreed to this. Partnership had requirements, and one of them was information. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he was starting to recognize, the look she had when something landed differently than she'd expected it to. When the map of him didn't match what her experience had taught her to expect. Then she turned back to the basin. Good night. Good night? He stayed at the table a few minutes after she'd gone down the hall. He could hear the wind picking up outside. The fire was burning low. He thought about Pharaoh, sitting in the back of Walt's feed store, asking questions. Thought about the letters that could travel between Wyoming and Philadelphia, the stories that could be summoned and reassembled into weapons at this distance. And then he thought about Evelyn's face when he'd said there's never been a school, that small, precise realignment of something behind her eyes. Like a compass, finding north. He thought, she's not going to wait to be defined here. She's going to do it herself. He thought, I'd like to see her try. He didn't mean it as doubt. He meant it as something close to anticipation. The moment with Pete came on a Thursday morning, unexpected, the way the real moments usually are. Evelyn had been helping Pete repair a section of the barn roof that had taken damage in the rain, small repairs, nothing complicated. Mostly a matter of someone handing up materials while Pete worked from a ladder and muttered complaints at the boards. She'd been at it for 2 hours without complaint, in the cold, fetching and passing and holding things steady when asked. Pete came down the ladder for a break and stood with his coffee, looking at the repaired section. "You done roof work before?" he asked. "No," she said. "But you tell me what you need and I manage to produce it. That's most of it." Pete was quiet for a minute. A hawk circled high above the barn. The wind had died down and the morning was sharp and clear. "Ryder says you were a teacher," Pete said, not a question. "I was. I am." She corrected herself deliberately. "I'm a teacher. What happened to it?" She looked at him. She knew from the way he asked that this was not idle curiosity. Pete Daniels asked a question only when the answer would change something. "A man with more power than decency," she said. "He wanted something from me, and when I refused, he made sure I couldn't work." Pete said nothing. He drank his coffee. "It was not my fault," she said. She said it evenly, without the need for him to agree, just as a statement of fact she had decided to stop treating as negotiable. Pete looked at her for a long moment. His face gave very little away. It had been weathered into a kind of stillness over the decades. Then he said, "Ryder's father was the same way. Straight lines." He paused. "His mother, too. Different kind of straight, but straight." It was the most personal information Pete had volunteered to her since she arrived. She understood that it was not a non sequitur. He was telling her something about the family she'd walked into, and by extension, something about his own assessment. Ryder's parents had been worth knowing. Ryder was worth knowing. And Pete, by standing here having this conversation, was telling her that he was starting to think she might be too. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" he said flatly, and handed her his empty cup and went back up the ladder. She stood there for a second with his cup in her hand and a feeling in her chest that was unusual, something she hadn't felt in a long while, which was the specific warmth of being somewhere that was, slowly and imperfectly, beginning to feel like it might be hers. Not because it was comfortable, it wasn't, not particularly. Not because the people were easy, they weren't, but because she was building it. With her own hands and her own choices and her own honest labor, she was building a place in this hard country, and no one, not Douglas Farrow with his letters and his land, not the Margaret Holts of Willow Ridge with their ledgers and their careful questions, had handed it to her. She was taking it, square foot by square foot, honest inch by honest inch. Up on the ladder, Pete called down for the next board. She found it, passed it up, and got back to work. 3 weeks after Evelyn Hart arrived in Willow Ridge, Ryder Blackwell did something that nobody in the valley had seen coming, including Evelyn herself. He sat across from her at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning when the ranch was quiet and the first hard frost had silvered everything outside the window, and he slid a piece of paper across the table toward her. She looked at it without touching it. It was a legal document. She recognized the format. She had enough education to know what a deed looked like, and what amendments to a deed looked like, and what it meant when a name was added to one. Her name, added to his. "What is this?" she said. It came out flat because she needed a second to locate her reaction before it located her. "What it looks like," Ryder said. She looked up at him. "You're offering me equal ownership." "Yes. Before the wedding, before we know, before anything is settled between us." "The wedding's next Saturday. That's settled." "Ryder." She put both hands flat on the table, on either side of the document, but not touching it. "This is 340 acres. This is your family's land. You don't know me well enough to do this." "I know you well enough." He said it without defensiveness, just as a statement. "You've been here 3 weeks. I've watched you work. I've watched you make decisions. I've watched you handle Pete, which frankly took me 2 years. He paused. "I know what I need to know." "You don't know what I came from." "I know exactly what you came from. You told me on the road the first night." She stood up from this table. Not in anger. She wasn't angry, she was rattled, which for Evelyn was in some ways more difficult to manage because she'd built a whole system for handling anger and almost nothing for handling unexpected generosity. She walked to the window and stood there looking out at the frost-white fields. "Men don't do this," she said. "Not here, not anywhere. Some men don't. All the men I've known don't." She turned around. "What do you get from this? Practically, legally? What does this cost you?" "If it goes wrong, half my land." He said it without flinching. "If it goes right, a partner who has actual stake in the decisions we're making together." He looked at her directly. "I'm not interested in running a ranch where the person making half the decisions has no legal standing in any of them. That's not a partnership. That's employment." She stared at him. That's an unusually principled position for a man who barely knows me. Maybe. Or maybe I just know what doesn't work. Something shifted in his expression. Brief, almost private. My mother ran half this ranch for 20 years, and her name was never on any of it. When my father died, she had to fight his brother for the right to stay in her own house for 2 months before the estate was settled. I watched that. He stopped. I'm not doing things that way. Evelyn was quiet for a long time. Outside, a gust of wind moved through the bare cottonwoods along the creek, making a dry rattling sound. The fire ticked behind her. In the distance, one of the horses made a low complaint about the cold. She came back to the table. She sat down. She picked up the document and read it, all of it, not skimming, the way she read everything, which was with complete attention and no performance of having understood something before she actually had. When she finished, she set it down. There are 3 conditions I want to add, she said. He blinked. It was the first time she'd seen him genuinely surprised. Conditions. Yes, if we're going to do this correctly, we should do it correctly. She folded her hands on the table. First, any decision that affects more than a quarter of the ranch's annual income requires both signatures. Neither of us moves that kind of money alone. He thought about it. Agreed. Second, if either of us decides this isn't working, the marriage, the arrangement, the land division is handled by negotiation, not by whoever has better legal standing at the time. We agree to that in writing now, before there's any reason to be unfair. A pause, longer this time. That protects you more than me. Right now, yes. In 5 years, maybe it protects you. We don't know. She held his gaze. I want it in writing. Agreed, he said. And the third? She hesitated. For the first time in the conversation, she hesitated. The third is not legal. It's a request. All right. Don't. She stopped, started again. Don't offer me this because you feel sorry for what happened to me back east. I need to know that's not what this is. The question sat between them. Ryder looked at her for a moment with the particular steadiness that was his natural resting state, the stillness of a man who had spent years making decisions in silence on a piece of land that didn't care about his feelings. Evelyn, if I felt sorry for you, I'd have offered you wages and a better room. I'm offering you this because you're the most practically intelligent person who has walked onto this property in the years I've run it, and I'd be an idiot to build something with you while keeping you on the outside of it. She absorbed that. The way she absorbed most things, without visible drama, turning it over internally, testing it for the places where it might be hollow. It wasn't hollow. All right, she said. For the second time since she arrived, she said it that way. The same word, the same quiet finality, the sound of a door not closing but opening. She picked up the pen from the table, where he'd already said it. She signed her name below his on the document. Her handwriting was small and precise and didn't waver. When she set down the pen, she looked at it for a moment. Her name, on a deed, on this land, in this valley, and felt something she hadn't felt in over a year, which was the specific, precarious sensation of having something to lose again. It was terrifying. She decided to treat that as a good sign. They were married the following Saturday by Preacher Morrison, a thin, tired-looking man who performed the ceremony in the front room of the ranch house, with Pete and Nora Calloway as witnesses, and Cobb standing in the doorway looking like he wasn't sure whether he'd been invited or not. Evelyn wore her green traveling dress, which Nora had insisted on pressing the night before with a flat iron borrowed from her own shop. Ryder wore a clean shirt and his best coat, which was not very different from his second best coat, but it was missing the tear on the left pocket. Morrison read through the ceremony efficiently. When he reached the part about the ring, Ryder produced one, a simple band, silver, nothing ornate, that had been his mother's, which he'd located at the bottom of a chest in the hallway the previous week. He had not told Evelyn this when he handed it to her, but Nora knew, and Nora's face did something brief and private that she quickly put away. When Morrison declared them married, Pete shook Ryder's hand with one firm pump, and then turned and shook Evelyn's hand with the same motion, which was the highest form of equality he was capable of expressing. Nora hugged Evelyn hard enough to be slightly alarming, and then produced a bottle of something from her coat pocket that she claimed was for special occasions, which it apparently was. Cobb, from the doorway, said congratulations, in a voice that broke only slightly on the second syllable. Morrison had cake. Nora had made it, and then Morrison had to leave to reach his next stop before dark, and then Nora had to leave. And then it was just the 4 of them again. Ryder, Evelyn, Pete, and Cobb, who was still not entirely sure what to do with himself. That evening, after the hands had gone to the bunkhouse and the fire was burning low and the house was quiet, Ryder and Evelyn sat at the kitchen table, their house, their land. And Ryder poured 2 small glasses of Nora's something, and they drank them without a toast because neither of them were people who toasted things, and then they sat with the silence for a while. "It was a good day," Evelyn said. She sounded slightly surprised by this. "Yeah," Ryder agreed. He sounded like a man who had been prepared for it to be difficult, and was mildly disoriented that it wasn't. She turned the silver band on her finger. It was slightly too large, which she'd noticed immediately and said nothing about, because it was the kind of imperfection you worked around rather than complained about. "Tell me about her," Evelyn said. "Your mother. What was she like?" He looked at the glass in his hands. "Stubborn, organized. She kept records of everything: weather, cattle numbers, prices, repairs. 50 years of records in a trunk in the hallway." He paused. "She had opinions about how the ranch should run, and she was usually right. And my father was smart enough to know she was right most of the time, but the law didn't require him to say so. And it made her angry. It made her quiet," he said, "which was worse." Evelyn said nothing for a moment. "I'm not going to be quiet about things." "I know." A beat. "I'd rather that." She looked at him sideways. "You say that now. I'll say it in 10 years. She made a sound that was almost a laugh. He almost smiled. Between the almost laugh and the almost smile, there was a moment that was neither of those things. Just 2 people across a table in a quiet house in the dark, beginning the long work of actually knowing each other. Douglas Farrow made his move in November, 6 weeks after Evelyn arrived. Ryder heard it from Walt Greer first, same as before, but this time Walt's expression was different, tighter, more deliberate, the face of a man delivering information he wishes he didn't have. "He got a letter," Walt said, "from Philadelphia. I don't know what's in it, but he was showing it to Morrison yesterday morning, and Morrison had an expression I didn't like." Ryder bought his supplies. He rode home, he told Evelyn. She sat at the table and listened to him with her hands flat on the wood and her face doing the thing it did when she was processing something without letting the processing show. He had gotten better at reading the small tells, the slight tension at the corner of her jaw, the way her breathing slowed rather than quickened when she was genuinely alarmed. "How long do we have before it's general knowledge?" she asked. "If Farrow wants it moved, a week, maybe less." She nodded. "Then I need to go to the town council before he does." "Evelyn, about the school." She looked up at him. "If I go to them now before he uses whatever he has, I'm a woman with a proposal. If I wait until after, I'm a woman defending herself." She held his eyes. "Those are not the same position." He knew she was right. He also knew that walking into a room with Farrow in it, carrying a past that Farrow had just weaponized in a letter, was not a small thing to ask of herself. "I'll come with you," he said. "I know you will." She stood up. "We go tomorrow." On. The town council met in the back room of Walt Greer's feed store, which was the largest private space in Willow Ridge that wasn't a saloon. Walt had cleared the crates from 2 rows and set out chairs, and by the time Ryder and Evelyn arrived, Morrison was already there, and Farrow was already there, and the particular quality of the air between those 2 men told Ryder that Walt's assessment had been correct. The letter had been shared. Farrow was 52 and had the build of a man who had worked hard in his youth and eaten well ever since, broad through the shoulders, gone soft at the middle, but still carrying himself with the physical confidence of someone who had not yet been made to understand its limits. He looked at Evelyn when she came in, the way a man looks at a hand he thinks he's already won. "Mrs. Blackwell," he said. He used the name deliberately, as if trying it for fit. "Mr. Farrow." Evelyn sat down. She put her hands in her lap. She looked at Walt and at Morrison with the same level attention, showing Farrow no more and no less than she showed the other men in the room. Ryder sat beside her. He did not pull out his chair with a scrape and make a production of being there. He simply sat, and his presence in the room had the quality that it always had in a room. Quiet, significant, not easily dismissed. Walt called the meeting to order in the way Walt did most things, which was without ceremony and with the assumption that everyone present had enough sense to get to the point. Evelyn got to the point. "There are 11 children in and around Willow Ridge between the ages of 5 and 14 who have no regular access to schooling," she said. "I know this because I've spent the last 3 weeks asking around quietly, and because Nora Calloway kept a list. She set the list on the table. I'm a trained and experienced teacher. I have 6 years in a Philadelphia academy, curriculum development, classroom management, individual instruction across age groups. I'm proposing to open a school in this town, and I'm asking this council for a space and a modest supply budget. The teaching itself, I'm offering without pay until the school is self-sustaining. Morrison leaned forward slightly. He was the kind of man whose moral instincts were generally decent, but who was susceptible to pressure from men with more social weight than himself. He looked at the list, and then he looked at Pharaoh. Pharaoh looked at Evelyn. "That's a generous offer," Pharaoh said. His tone was the tone of a man building to something, though it raises a question of qualification. "I've named my qualifications," Evelyn said. "Your previous qualifications, yes." He reached into his coat. "I've had some correspondence from Philadelphia. I think the council should be aware of certain circumstances that led to your departure from teaching there." The room went very still. Evelyn did not move. Her hand stayed in her lap. Her breathing did not change, or if it did, it changed in a direction nobody could read. Ryder, watching her from 18 inches away, thought, "She knew this was coming. She's had 3 days to prepare for this room, and she walked into it anyway." "Mr. Pharaoh," she said. Her voice was entirely level. "If you have a letter from Philadelphia, I'd like to know the name of the person who wrote it." Pharaoh blinked. He hadn't expected that. "The name," she said again. "Who wrote to you?" He looked at the letter. "A Mr. Gerald Caldwell, who was the headmaster of—" "Who is the man who dismissed me?" Evelyn said. "Who is the man who made advances toward me for 2 years, which I refused, and who responded to that refusal by fabricating a series of complaints to his board of directors in order to have me removed and my teaching certificate suspended?" She said it without raising her voice, without drama. "The way you state a fact that you have decided to stop being ashamed of. Whatever that letter contains is the account of a man protecting himself from the consequences of his own behavior." Morrison's expression shifted. He was a man who paid attention to the human texture of things, and the human texture of what he was seeing was a woman who is telling the truth. Pharaoh recalibrated. "Even granting your account, I'm not asking you to grant it," Evelyn said. "I'm asking you to consider the source of the letter and then ask yourself whether you've seen, in the 6 weeks I've been in this valley, any evidence that I am what Caldwell says I am." She looked at Morrison. "Preacher Morrison, you performed my wedding last week. Have you seen anything of concern?" "No," Morrison said quietly. "Walt," she turned, "I've been in your store 3 times. I've introduced myself to your wife. I've been a member of this community for 6 weeks. What have you seen?" Walt looked at Pharaoh for a brief second. Then he looked at Evelyn. "Nothing but someone trying to do right," he said. Pharaoh's jaw tightened. "It's not a question of personal conduct since arriving. It's a question of whether we know the full story of who we're—" "You know the full story," Ryder said. It was the first time he'd spoken. The room shifted slightly toward him, not because he was loud, he wasn't, but because when Ryder Blackwell spoke in a room, the weight of it landed differently than most men. "I knew the full story before I asked her to come here," Ryder said. He looked at Pharaoh without hostility and without backing down. "Every part of it. I made a decision with that information in hand. The deed on my ranch has her name on it. That's not a mistake I made. That's a decision I made, and I'd make it again." He paused. "So whatever the purpose of that letter is, Douglas, you should know that anything you do to try to damage her position here, you're doing to mine as well." The explicit threat was not in the words. It was in the fact that Ryder Blackwell, who had been refusing to sell his north pasture for 3 years, had just made clear that this conversation was now part of whatever came next between them. Pharaoh understood that. He was not a stupid man. He was a man who had miscalculated the room. He looked at the letter in his hand for a moment. Then he put it back in his coat. "I'm prepared to support the proposal," Morrison said. He said it with the quiet decisiveness of a man who has located his moral position and intends to stand on it. "A school serves these families. That's what matters here." Walt nodded. "Same." Pharaoh said nothing for a moment. The room waited. Then he said, "I'll abstain." It was not support, but it was not opposition, and in the arithmetic of the room, it was enough. Walt wrote it down. The meeting went on for another 20 minutes. Details about the old storage room at the back of the building that had once been used for the land office before it moved to Laramie, the matter of basic supplies, a modest budget. Evelyn answered every question with the competence of someone who had done this before, and knew exactly what she needed and what she could manage without. Morrison warmed to her as the conversation went on. She had a way of making people feel that their concerns were reasonable without capitulating to concerns that weren't. When they walked out into the cold November afternoon, Ryder and Evelyn side by side, the door closing behind them on the low murmur of Walt and Morrison still talking, Evelyn stopped on the step and stood very still for a second. He waited. She let out a long, slow breath. It misted in the cold air. "All right," she said, quieter than usual. She sounded like someone who has been holding something up for a long time and has just been allowed to put it down. "You did that," Ryder said. "We did that." She glanced at him sideways. "What you said in there, about the deed, about it being your decision. It's true. I know it's true." She looked out at the main street of Willow Ridge, the storefronts, the bare trees, the wide, cold sky. "Nobody said something like that for me in a very long time." He didn't know what to do with that exactly, so he said the honest thing, which was, then they were wrong not to. She turned and looked at him fully. He looked back. Between them was the cold air of a Wyoming November and 6 weeks of learning each other, and a document with both their names on it and a room they had just walked out of together. She didn't say anything, neither did he. They walked to the wagon. That evening, Evelyn sat at the table with a blank ledger she'd bought from Walt's store and began to plan. Curriculum, schedule, age groupings, supply lists, the kind of systematic, unglamorous preparatory work that is invisible to everyone except the person doing it, and that is the actual foundation of everything that looks effortless later. Ryder came in from the last evening check, hung his coat, washed his hands at the basin. He looked at what she was doing. "What's the first lesson?" he asked. "Reading," she said without looking up. "Always reading. Everything else depends on it." He went to make coffee. She kept writing. The fire was solid and steady, and outside the November wind was picking up across the open land, the kind of wind that found every weakness in a structure and tested it, the way this valley tested everything. But the house held. It held the way things hold when they've been built properly. Not without cracks, not without history in the walls, but with enough good material and enough true joining that the pressure just moved through and left the frame standing. Evelyn looked up from her ledger. Ryder set a cup of coffee beside her hand without being asked. She looked at it, then at him, then back at her work. "Thank you," she said. He said, and sat down in his own chair and picked up the ranch accounts, and they worked across from each other in the firelit room while the wind made its noise outside, and neither of them said anything more, because for once nothing more needed saying. The school was happening. Whatever Pharaoh had tried to bring into that room, he'd left without it. And somewhere in the arithmetic of that evening, the coffee and the ledger and the accounts and the fire, something that had been tightly coiled in Evelyn's chest since the day she left Philadelphia, loosened by one more increment, not all the way, not even close to all the way, but one more increment, one more. She was beginning to understand how it was going to happen, not in a single moment of relief, but in fractions, small and hard won, each one requiring the one before it. She could live with that. She had always been good at the long work. The school opened on the first Monday of December in the old land office storage room at the back of the feed store building, which smelled like sawdust and old leather and the particular closed-up cold of a space that hadn't been used in 2 years. Evelyn had spent 4 days preparing it. She'd scrubbed the floor herself, on her knees with a brush and a bucket of water that went cold faster than she could work. She'd borrowed 2 long tables from Nora and arranged them so the light from the single south-facing window fell across them at the right angle. She'd made a chalkboard out of a piece of smooth pine board painted with a mixture she'd gotten the recipe for from a hardware catalog, lampblack and linseed oil, 3 coats, sanded between each. It wasn't perfect, it worked. Ryder had come by on the 3rd day, looked at what she was doing without comment, and then left and come back an hour later with peat and a cast-iron stove small enough to fit in the corner, its flue pipe fitted through a hole they cut in the wall while Evelyn held the level and told them when the cut was drifting. "You didn't have to do that," she said, when the stove was in and Pete was outside sealing the pipe joint with clay. "Room's too cold for children to learn anything," Ryder said. He was looking at the chalkboard with the expression he used when he was evaluating a thing's functionality. Does it write clean? Clean enough. She picked up a stick of chalk and wrote a word on it. The letters came out reasonably sharp. I wanted it better. This is what I have. Children won't care. He looked at the tables, the window, the stove. It looks like a school. It is a school. She said it the way she'd been saying things lately, not with force, but with a kind of settled certainty, as if she was nailing a board into place one word at a time. He looked at her, and there was something in his face she didn't examine too closely because she wasn't ready for what examining it might tell her. I know, he said. Well, 7 children came on the first morning. 3 more arrived by the end of the week when their parents heard from the first 7's parents that it was real, that it was warm, that Mrs. Blackwell was the kind of teacher who did not hit hands with rulers and did not make a child feel stupid for not knowing a thing they hadn't yet been taught. The youngest was 5, a girl named Clara Ames, daughter of the farrier, who arrived on the first day clutching her father's hand with both of hers and staring at Evelyn with enormous dark eyes. Evelyn crouched to the girl's level and said, I need someone to help me hand out the pencils. Do you think you could do that? And Clara Ames let go of her father's hand and took the pencils with the gravity of someone who has been given an important office. The oldest student was 13, a boy named Thomas Greer, Walt's son, who arrived clearly expecting to be bored and left that first Friday with 2 pages of arithmetic he wanted to finish over the weekend, which astonished his father enough that Walt mentioned it to Ryder the next time he came in for supplies. Evelyn taught mornings, 5 days a week. She walked the 2 miles into town and back because the wagon was needed on the ranch, and on the days the weather allowed it, she didn't mind the walk. It gave her time to think, to plan the next day's lessons, to let the wide, cold sky clear out whatever accumulated weight the previous day had left in her. On the days the weather didn't allow it, Ryder drove her in before the sun was properly up and came back for her at noon. He didn't frame this as a concession or a favor. He simply did it the way he did most things, as a practical response to a practical situation. She noticed. She didn't comment on it, because commenting on it would have made it into something it wasn't, or something he'd feel obligated to deny caring about. Instead, she made sure the coffee was ready before he was up on those mornings, and he drank it standing at the window looking at the gray pre-dawn sky, and she finished the braid she'd been doing in her hair and picked up her bag of lesson materials, and they went. It was not romance. It was not yet. It was something more functional, and in some ways more durable. 2 people who had decided to show up for each other without requiring an audience for it. Well, December moved toward Christmas with the velocity that winter always has in Wyoming, fast and grinding, the cold deepening each week until the air itself seemed to crystallize. The ranch work contracted inward, less range work, more close maintenance, keeping the cattle from drifting too far in the blowing snow, checking water sources that tended to ice over overnight. Ryder worked long days and came in after dark smelling like cold and livestock, and Evelyn had learned to have something warm on the stove at that hour because it was not sentimentality. It was the practical reality that a man who has been outside for 12 hours in December needs warmth and food before he is useful for anything else, including conversation. She learned other things about him too, in the way you learn a person when you live close to them, not through grand revelations, but through accumulation. I was a man who slept lightly and was already thinking about the day before he was properly awake. He had a way of going quiet that was different from his usual quiet, a darker, more internal silence that appeared when something was worrying him, and that he did not volunteer information about unless you asked the right question in the right way. She learned the right questions. North fence, she'd say, or cattle numbers, or sometimes just, what is it? Direct and plain, the way he preferred, and he would answer with the actual content of what was troubling him, which was always something specific and manageable, and the act of saying it out loud seemed to diminish it slightly. He noticed things about her, too. The headaches that came when she'd been grading by insufficient light too long, the way she carried tension in her left shoulder, from the writing, from the chalk work, and rolled it out absently while she read in the evenings. The specific expression she wore when a student had done something that moved her, but which she was not going to show sentimentally because she did not believe in doing that. The expression that was almost nothing but not quite. He never said he noticed these things. He just occasionally angled the lamp closer when she was grading, or didn't start a conversation that required her full attention when she was deep in a paper, or on the bad headache evenings found a reason to be in the kitchen making noise that meant she could stop working without feeling like she'd chosen to stop. This was how they moved toward each other, sideways, practical, without naming it. The storm came on this 22nd of December with almost no warning, or rather, with the warning that Pete recognized at 4 in the afternoon when he came in from the upper pasture and said, standing in the doorway of the barn with snow already beginning to fall, "This is going to be bad." Pete's assessment of weather was not hyperbolic. In 40 years on this land, he had seen what winter could do. And when he said bad, he meant the kind of bad that cost cattle and occasionally people. Ryder went straight to pulling the herd in from the north and east pastures. Cobb took the horses. Evelyn, without being asked, took the lantern and went to the water supply to break the ice that was already forming and make sure the drainage wasn't backing up. She'd learned this from Pete 2 weeks earlier, and she did it the way Pete had shown her, methodically, without wasting motion. The snow came down serious and sideways by 5 o'clock. By 6, the visibility from the house was 10 feet. By 7, it was less. They were all inside by then, the 4 of them, the horses in the barn, the cattle in the lower field with the wind shelter Marcus had built years ago on the western slope. Whether the shelter would be enough depended on how long and how hard the storm blew. The 4 of them ate at the table together, which didn't happen often. Pete and Cobb usually took their meals in the bunkhouse. But nobody was going back out in this. Not tonight. And the bunkhouse stove was smaller than the kitchen stove, and the kitchen was where the food was. Cobb had gotten over most of his speechlessness around Evelyn by this point, though he still occasionally forgot mid-sentence what he'd been planning to say when she looked at him directly. He was talking now about a story his older brother had told him about a storm 3 years before, which Pete periodically corrected with the particular precision of someone who has accurate information and believes incorrect information is a form of disrespect to the event. "It wasn't 3 days," Pete said. "It was 4.5. My brother said 3. Your brother spent 2 of those days unconscious with a fever, so his counting was off." Cobb considered this. "That's fair?" Evelyn, sitting across from Ryder, was watching Pete with the quiet attention she brought to things that interested her. She'd told Ryder once, in a rare unguarded moment, that Pete was the most competent person she'd ever lived around, including people with much more formal education. She'd meant it as a direct observation, not a compliment, which was why it was both. "How long does this one run?" she asked Pete. Pete looked at his food. "Day and a half. Maybe 2. He paused. "We'll lose some cattle if the shelter doesn't hold the east side." "It'll hold," Ryder said. Pete said nothing, which was either agreement or the silence of a man who hopes he's wrong and doesn't want to say so. The wind outside made a sound against the roof that was not a howl. It was deeper than a howl, a continuous pressure, like the whole weight of the sky leaning on the structure. The lamp on the table flickered once, held. "I'm going to read to you," Evelyn said. Everyone looked at her. "It's going to be a long night," she said. "I have a book. It's better than sitting here listening to that." She gestured upward toward the sound of the wind. "Unless someone objects." Nobody objected. Cobb actually looked relieved. She got the book from the main room, Washington Irving, which she'd been reading herself for a week, and she came back and sat at the table and opened it to the beginning and read aloud. Her reading voice was different from her speaking voice, more textured, less guarded, the cadences coming naturally because she'd been doing it in classrooms for years, and it was one of the few things she did without any layer of self-monitoring over it. Ryder listened. Pete ate slowly and listened. Cobb listened with his elbows on the table and his chin in his hands, like a much younger person than he was. Outside, the storm did what it did. Inside, the lamp burned and the stove held its heat, and the words of the story moved around the table. And for a couple of hours, the particular dread of a bad storm on a working ranch, the accounting of everything that could go wrong, the livestock calculations, the structural worries, was held at a small distance by the simple human technology of a story told aloud. Later, when Pete and Cobb had gone to their corner of the house, and the ranch was as settled as it was going to get until morning, Ryder and Evelyn sat by the main room fire. The wind was still going. It hadn't peaked yet. They could both tell by the quality of the sound. "You should sleep," she said. "Can't yet." He was looking at the fire. "I need to check the barn at midnight. The door latch on the east side has been loose." "I'll go at midnight. You sleep until 2 and then go." He looked at her. "I'm serious," she said. "I can check a latch. In that wind, I'll rope to the barn door from the porch post. I'm not stupid." She met his eyes. "You've been up since 5 this morning. If something goes bad with the cattle at 3 in the morning, you need to be functional. That means sleep now. He looked at her for a long moment. The fire between them snapped at a piece of green wood and then settled. All right, he said. She looked slightly surprised that he'd agreed. He noticed this. You were right, he said simply. That's usually what gets my agreement. Something moved across her face. It wasn't a smile exactly. It was something that happened on the way to a smile and stopped there, which was more honest than the destination. He went to bed. She sat by the fire with the book in the wind, and at midnight she tied the rope to the porch post and walked through the storm to the barn and checked the latch. It was fine, had held, and walked back through the blowing snow with the rope in her hand, and came inside and hung up her coat and sat back down. Her hands were shaking slightly from the cold. She pressed them flat on the book cover until they stopped. At 2 o'clock she knocked once on Ryder's door. He was awake before she finished knocking. She told him the latch was fine, and the east wall of the cattle shelter appeared to be holding from what she could see. He nodded, got up, put on his coat. Evelyn, he said at the door. She had already turned to go back to the fire. She looked back. Thank you, he said. Not the efficient kind of thank you that dispensed with a social obligation. The other kind. She looked at him for a second in the low lamplight, both of them slightly ragged from the broken night, the storm still working at the outside of the house. Go check the barn, she said. He went. The storm ran 38 hours. They lost 4 cattle, 2 to cold, 2 to a section of the shelter wall that came down under the weight of accumulated snow in the second night. It could have been much worse. Pete said so, which for Pete was the equivalent of a detailed speech about providence and luck. The morning after the storm cleared, Evelyn walked out onto the porch in the early pale light and looked at the changed landscape. Everything white and still. The fence posts wearing caps of snow. The cottonwoods along the creek transformed into something angular and silent. The cold was the cleanest cold she'd experienced, the kind that made the air feel new. She heard the door behind her. Ryder came out and stood beside her. They looked at it together for a moment. 4, he said. He was talking about the cattle. I know. She'd heard the count at breakfast. North pasture fence took damage, 3 sections down. How long to repair? Week, if the weather holds. 2 if it doesn't. He exhaled, his breath making a cloud. Sets us back on the spring figures. She thought about the ledger in the house, the numbers she'd been keeping alongside his. If we pull the repair cost from the reserve, we're still above the margin we set. Barely. Barely is above. She looked at the snow-covered fields. And we have the school supply budget from the council. I haven't touched the portion that came from Walt's personal contribution. That's separate from the ranch accounts, but it's liquid if we needed it in an emergency. He turned his head to look at her. That's the school's money. I know that. She met his eyes. I said if we needed it, we don't. I'm telling you the picture. That's all. I was quiet for a moment. You've been tracking all of it. We agreed. Anything over a quarter of the annual income, both signatures. I should know all the numbers for that to mean anything. He looked at her for a beat longer than he needed to for the conversation they were having. Then he looked back out at the snow. When Marcus ran the ranch with me, he said slowly, I used to go over the accounts with him every Sunday. After he left, I stopped. It seemed, he paused, pointless, going over numbers alone. She heard what he wasn't saying. She did not point directly at it, because that was not how they did things with each other. Instead, she said, Sundays work for me too, after I'm back from the school preparation. Yeah, he said. All right. They stood there a while longer in the clean, cold air, 2 people looking at the damage the storm had left, and the land that remained under it, acres and acres of it, theirs, both of theirs, waiting for the spring work that would start the whole relentless year again. But Christmas came and went quietly. Nora came out to the ranch for the day, which she apparently did every year, a tradition that had started when Ryder's mother was alive. She brought pie and strong opinions about the temperature of the house, and a small carved wooden thing for Evelyn that she presented without ceremony. A bird, some kind of raptor, with good detail in the wings. I make them in the evenings, Nora said, as if this required no further explanation. It's beautiful, Evelyn said. It's a rough copy of a rough original, but the intention's there. Nora looked at her with the directness she always used. How are you? Actually. Actually? Evelyn turned the carving in her hands. Better than I expected to be. And him? Evelyn glanced toward the barn where Ryder and Pete had gone. Better than he'll say. Nora made a sound of satisfaction. Good. He's been... She paused, considering. Ryder has been running on obligation and stubbornness for a long time. A man can do that for years before he realizes the tank's empty. Evelyn set the carving on the windowsill where the winter light hit it. He's not empty. No, Nora agreed. He's not, now. She said it simply and didn't press it further, which was one of the many things Evelyn appreciated about Nora Calloway. She delivered her perceptions and then stepped back and let them settle on their own. January arrived. The way January always does. Without apology, just a deepening of everything December had already started. The school continued through it, 5 mornings a week, the children arriving red-faced and shedding snow from their boots in the doorway, and Evelyn teaching with the stove going and the chalkboard full, and the particular focused energy she brought to a room full of minds that wanted something from her. Thomas Greer, the 13-year-old, had turned into her best reader. He was the kind of student who made a teacher's work feel meaningful, the kind who took what you gave him and went further with it on his own, and came back with questions you had to actually think about. He asked her one January morning, looking at a passage in a reader she'd ordered from Laramie, whether the person who wrote it had ever actually been to the place they were describing. "Why do you ask?" she said. "Because they got it wrong, the way they describe how the river smells. Rivers here don't smell like that." She looked at him. 12 weeks ago, this boy had arrived expecting to be bored. "You're right. Write me a paragraph about how the river actually smells. 50 words. Tonight." He looked at her. "You want me to write about a smell?" "I want you to write what's true. Start there and everything else follows." She turned back to the board. 50 words. He did it. She read it standing at the window of the kitchen that evening after supper. Ryder was across the table with the accounts. She read the paragraph twice. It was uneven and slightly overlong and had a sentence in the middle that was genuinely good, sharp and real, and 12-year-old in the best sense. "Listen to this," she said. He looked up. She read the middle sentence aloud, the one about the river. Ryder was quiet for a moment. "Kid wrote that?" "Thomas Greer." "Yes." "Huh." He looked at the accounts, then back at her. "Walt's going to be insufferably proud." "Walt should be." He almost smiled. She caught it, the way she'd learned to catch the small ones, and went back to her reading and said nothing about it because the moment was better left alone. February brought the thing that neither of them had named. It arrived the way those things do, not in a declaration or a confrontation, but in an accumulation of small moments that crossed some invisible threshold and became something else. It was a Tuesday evening. Evelyn had come back from town with a pulled muscle in her shoulder. She'd slipped on ice on the road, caught herself on a fence post, wrenched something in the process. She hadn't said anything about it when Ryder picked her up at the school. She'd said she was fine. He'd looked at her. "You're not fine," he'd said. "I'm functional." "That's not the same thing." "It's close enough." At home, she'd tried to reach the upper shelf in the kitchen for the willow bark she kept there for headaches, and her shoulder hadn't cooperated, and she'd made a sound, not a dramatic sound, just a small, involuntary complaint. And Ryder had come in from the main room immediately. "Let me," he said. "I can—" "Evelyn." He said her name the way he said things when he was finished negotiating. He got the tin from the shelf and set it on the counter, and then, without asking, put his hands on her shoulders from behind and found the muscle that was the problem. He knew where to look because he'd pulled the same one on the same fence post in winter 2 years running, and worked at it. She went completely still. Not the still of discomfort, the other kind. I was not unaware of the shift. His hands slowed slightly. He did not stop. "Better?" he said. His voice was different, quieter, with a quality she hadn't heard before. "Yes," she said. It came out lower than she intended. A moment passed. His hands stilled on her shoulders, not removed, just still. She could feel the warmth of them through the fabric of her dress. She turned around. They were close, closer than they'd been before in the narrow kitchen, in the way that small rooms create proximity that you don't always account for until you're in it. She looked up at him. He looked down at her. His expression was the open one, the one he mostly kept for moments he thought nobody was watching. No guardedness, no management of what showed. "Ryder," she said. "Yeah," he said, not answering a question, just acknowledging that she'd said his name. "This is She stopped, started differently. I didn't come here expecting this. Neither did I. I need you to know that whatever this is, I'm not. She pressed her lips together, tried again. I'm not doing this because you gave me land or because I needed saving. I want that to be clear. He looked at her with an expression that was somewhere between exasperation and something much warmer. I know that. I want to say it. You've said it. I'm saying it again. Evelyn. He said her name with a quietness that had weight in it. I know. She looked at him. The lamp behind him was low, and the kitchen was warm, and outside the February wind was going about its business the way it always was. Relentless, indifferent, doing what it did to everything in the valley. She reached up and put her hand against the side of his face. It was not a practiced gesture. It was an honest one, slightly uncertain, slightly tentative, the gesture of someone doing something they've decided to do before they've fully talked themselves into it or out of it. His hand came up and covered hers. They stood like that for a moment. Then she leaned forward the small distance that remained between them, and he met her halfway. And what happened next was not graceful or cinematic. It was two people who were tired and windburned and imperfect and had been cautiously moving toward each other for 4 months, finally arriving at the same place at the same time, and the arriving was better than either of them had the vocabulary to say. Later, sitting by the fire with the kind of silence that is not empty but full, the particular quiet of something that has shifted and settled, she sat with her feet tucked up in her chair, and he sat in his with his head resting back, and the fire did what fires do. I should tell you something, she said. He turned his head toward her. I was afraid, she said. When I signed the deed, I was afraid I'd become someone who needed what you gave me, that I'd lose the part of myself that wasn't dependent. She looked at the fire. I've been watching myself very carefully. I know you have, he said. Does it bother you? He thought about it. Actually thought about it, rather than giving her the answer that would be easiest. No, he said finally. A person watching themselves is different from a person who doesn't trust you. I know which one you're doing. She was quiet for a moment. How do you know? Because the first one is about you and the second one would show in how you treat me. He paused. You treat me straight. You always have. She turned to look at him. That's enough for me, he said. She looked at the fire again. Something in her chest was doing something she didn't have a clean word for. Something that was the opposite of the hollow feeling she'd arrived with. Not the opposite in the sense of euphoria or certainty or any of those easy things. The opposite in the way that solid ground is the opposite of the feeling of falling. Not dramatic, just real, just the reliable fact of something under your feet. The school, she said. What about it? I think I want to expand it. Next fall. More children. Possibly some of the older ones who've missed years of schooling. She paused. I'd need to talk to the council. I'd need to argue for a proper budget. You'll get it, he said. I might have to fight Pharaoh again. He's going to run out of angles. She almost smiled. Don't underestimate a man who has more resources than principles. Fair. He looked at the ceiling. But don't underestimate a woman who's already beaten him once on his own ground. She turned the silver ring on her finger, still slightly too large, something she'd been meaning to address for months and kept not addressing, some small superstition about not fixing what was holding. She looked at it in the firelight. Ryder, she said. Yeah. I'm glad the stage was late. He was quiet for a second, then, I wasn't when I was standing there. I know. She looked over at him. But you are now. He held her gaze for a long moment, and on his face was the expression she'd been learning the whole winter. The open one, the unguarded one, the one that a man like Ryder Blackwell didn't show a room but would show, she was beginning to understand. The right person in the right quiet. Yeah, he said. I am. The fire burned. The wind went on outside the way it always did, testing the walls, finding them solid, moving on. Spring came to the Blackwell Ranch, the way it always came to Wyoming. Not gently, not all at once, but in arguments. A warm week followed by a hard frost. Mud that froze overnight and thawed again by noon. The cottonwoods along the creek putting out tentative green in the first week of April, and then getting hit with snow in the second, stubbornly keeping the green anyway because that was what cottonwoods did. They didn't wait for permission from the weather. Evelyn noticed this about them. She'd been noticing the cottonwoods all winter, their bare gray architecture against the sky. And now she watched them refuse the late snow with something that felt personal. She was 4 months pregnant. She hadn't told Ryder yet. Not because she was afraid of how he'd receive it. She knew how he'd receive it, had a reasonable confidence in that now, after the winter they'd had together. She hadn't told him because she was still in the process of telling herself, of sitting with it in the mornings when she woke before the house stirred and pressing her hand flat against her stomach and trying to locate what she felt about it, which was not simple. It was never going to be simple. What she felt was something like vertigo. The particular dizziness of a life expanding past the edges of what you'd planned for it. She had come to Wyoming to rebuild one thing, herself, her work, her standing. And somewhere in the winter she had built considerably more than that without fully tracking each addition as it happened. She told him on a Thursday evening in April, after supper, when the last of the daylight was going and the kitchen was warm and he was going over the spring cattle figures at the table. She sat down across from him and waited until he looked up. "I'm pregnant," she said. He put down his pencil. He looked at her with the open expression, the one she'd come to read as his most honest face, the one that meant he wasn't managing what showed. And what showed was not alarm, not the complicated male panic she'd half braced for. What showed was something quieter and more internal, like a man recalculating the dimensions of a room he thought he knew. "How far?" he said. "About 4 months. I think late September." I was quiet for a moment. She waited. She had learned that his silences needed room. "Are you—" He stopped, rephrased. "How are you feeling about it?" She considered giving him the easy answer. She gave him the real one instead. "I'm not sure yet. I feel—" She looked at the table. "It wasn't something I let myself think about much. After Philadelphia. Having a child felt like it belonged to a version of my life that wasn't available anymore." She looked up. "And now it's available again, and I'm still catching up to that." He nodded, slowly, like he was absorbing the weight of what she was carrying inside the sentence, not just the sentence itself. "Are you scared?" she asked. "Yes," he said. No hesitation. She almost smiled. "What part?" "All of it." He looked at his hands on the table. "I don't know how to do this. I watched my father do it wrong in specific ways, and I've been aware my whole adult life that knowing the wrong way doesn't automatically show you the right one." He paused. "But I'd rather be scared and doing it than not doing it." She looked at him across the table in the spring evening light. "That might be the most honest thing you've ever said to me. I try not to waste time on the dishonest version." He picked up his pencil, set it down again. "We should tell Pete." "In the morning. He'll pretend he already knew." "He might actually already know," Evelyn said. "He's been looking at me differently for 2 weeks." Ryder absorbed this. "Yeah, that sounds like Pete." They sat for another moment in the comfortable way they'd developed over the winter, close to silence without quite being in it. Two people who had gotten past the stage of needing to fill space between them. "Ryder," she said. "Yeah." "I'm glad. I want you to know that. Underneath the vertigo, I'm glad." He looked at her with the quiet, open face. "Good," he said. "Me too." Pete took the news the next morning by going very still for 3 seconds, looking at Evelyn's midsection briefly, and then not again, and then turning back to the fence post he'd been working on and saying, "We'll need to fix the loose board on the porch before winter. Can't have ice near the steps." Which was Pete's way of saying he was thinking about the future and intending to be in it. Cobb said, "Oh," and then turned red from his collar to his hairline, and then said congratulations, and then found somewhere else to be for 20 minutes. When he came back, he was normalized and did not bring it up again, which was the correct behavior for Cobb. Nora came out the following Sunday and sat with Evelyn in the kitchen while the men were in the barn and said several things that were practical and a few that were unexpectedly tender, and then said, "You're going to be a better mother than you think you are," which Evelyn hadn't asked for and needed more than she could have predicted. "How do you know that?" Evelyn said. "Because you're paying attention," Nora said simply. "Most people aren't. Most people go through the whole thing on instinct and habit, which is usually their parents' instinct and habit, and it goes on like that." She poured more coffee. "You're actually thinking about it. Thinking people make mistakes, but they make different mistakes. Better ones." Evelyn turned this over. "That's a low bar. Honey, it's the bar everyone's working with. The question is whether you clear it." Nora looked at her steadily. "You will." The school expansion proposal went before the council in May, and this time Pharaoh came prepared. He had spent the winter recalibrating. as men like him did when a frontal approach failed, pulling back, looking for a different angle, waiting for the moment when the opposition's attention was elsewhere. He'd been civil to Ryder at the grain exchange in March. He'd said nothing publicly about Evelyn. He'd given every appearance of a man who had accepted a situation. Evelyn had not been fooled. She had the particular radar of someone who has been blindsided once by a man who smiled before he moved against her, and that radar had been quietly registering Pharaoh's silence as strategy, not concession. She was right. He came to the May Council meeting with a proposal of his own, a plan to convert the land office building into a commercial storage space that he would lease from the town for a modest fee, citing the need for economic development in Willow Ridge. The storage room at the back of that building, where the school currently operated, would naturally be absorbed into this arrangement. It was well constructed. It didn't target Evelyn or the school directly. It went at the foundation instead. She sat in her chair and listened to him present it, and felt the cold, specific anger of someone watching a move they anticipated but couldn't have prevented. Morrison looked uncomfortable. Walt Greer looked like a man who had just bitten into something he hadn't expected to find in his food. Pharaoh looked like a man who believed he had won. This would displace the school, Walt said. I'm afraid so, Pharaoh said, with the expression of someone who is not afraid at all. Though I'd certainly be open to discussing alternative arrangements. Perhaps Mrs. Blackwell would consider offering lessons from the ranch. A pause. More of a private arrangement, naturally. Private. Out of town, out of sight. No standing, no space, no council support. The school reduced to something easily ignored and easily ended. It was, Evelyn recognized, elegantly done. She let him finish. She waited through the brief silence that followed. Then she opened the folder she'd brought to the table. I have a counter-proposal, she said. Pharaoh looked at the folder. Mrs. Blackwell, this is a council. Mr. Pharaoh's proposal affects the school directly, Morrison said. He said it with the mild but clear tone of a man who had been thinking about his position all winter. I think it's appropriate to hear a response. Evelyn set documents on the table. 13 children are currently enrolled in the Willow Ridge School, she said. 3 months ago, there were 7. At current growth, we'll have 18 to 20 by fall. She turned a page. These are letters from 5 families in this valley stating that they chose not to relocate to Laramie this year, which they had been considering, specifically because their children now have access to schooling in Willow Ridge. She looked at Pharaoh. Those are 5 families with land, livestock, and purchasing habits that support every business in this town, including the grain exchange. She paused. Which you have a stake in. Pharaoh's expression did not change, but something in it went careful. There's a second point, she said. She turned to the next document. Last month I wrote to the Wyoming Territorial Board of Education outlining the situation in Willow Ridge and requesting formal recognition of the school as a licensed territorial institution. That recognition would come with a territorial funding allocation, a small one, but real, that would go into the town's general fund. She set the page down. That letter was acknowledged 3 weeks ago. The review process is underway. She looked at the 3 men across the table. If the council displaces the school now, it would likely disqualify Willow Ridge from receiving that designation and the funding that comes with it. The room was very quiet. Walt leaned forward and looked at the letter from the territorial board. He read it. He set it down. Douglas, he said, and nothing else. That was enough. There was a tone in Walt Greer's voice when he said a man's first name that communicated the full content of his opinion without requiring elaboration. Pharaoh was quiet for a long moment. He was, as Evelyn had said to Ryder months ago, not a stupid man. He could see the math. He could see that the room had shifted, that what had looked like a clean move had landed on ground that had been prepared against it. He could see that the woman across the table had been 3 steps ahead of him and had not shown it until this moment. The thing about a man like Pharaoh, though, and this was the thing Evelyn had understood from the beginning, from that first night on the road when she'd explained what Caldwell had done and how, was that the most dangerous moment wasn't when he was confident, it was when he wasn't. I'd like to table my proposal, Pharaoh said. His voice was flat. Tabled, Walt said immediately. Morrison wrote it down. Evelyn's expansion proposal passed 2-1, with Pharaoh abstaining for the second time, and she had the particular sensation of a person who has been running very hard and has just been allowed to stop. Not collapse, just stop, just stand on a ground that is not moving and breathe. She walked out of that meeting into the May afternoon and stood in the street and breathed the air that smelled like mud and new grass and the creek running high with snowmelt. Ryder was waiting by the wagon. He looked at her face. "Done?" he said. "Done." She walked to him. Pharaoh tabled it, the expansions approved. He studied her expression. "You expected him to try something." "I expected him to try that specific thing," she said. "I've been preparing for it since February." He looked at her for a moment. "You didn't tell me." "I needed to handle it." She met his eyes. "Not because I didn't trust you, because it needed to be mine to handle. Do you understand the difference?" He thought about it honestly, which was the only way he thought about things. "Yeah," he said, "I do." She got into the wagon. He climbed up beside her. The main street of Willow Ridge went about its business around them. Horses at the rail, women crossing toward the dry goods, someone hammering at the far end of the street. "Is it finished?" Ryder asked. "With Pharaoh?" "No," she said. "Men like him don't finish, but he knows now that I'm not going anywhere and I'm not going to be easy. That changes his arithmetic." She looked out at the street. "He'll find something else to put his energy toward, someone who hasn't prepared." Ryder was quiet for a moment, then, "I'm sorry you have to know how to do that." She turned to look at him. It was an unexpected thing for him to say. Unexpected in its directness, in the acknowledgement of what it cost to be the kind of woman who knew how to fight on these terms. "Don't be sorry," she said. "It's useful." "Doesn't mean it's fair." She held his gaze. "No," she said. "It doesn't." They drove home. The summer was the hardest working season Evelyn had experienced since arriving in Wyoming, and she had not arrived in an easy season. She was pregnant through the heat of June and July and August, teaching through June before the summer break, managing the ranch's daily administration in the mornings, learning from Nora how to put up vegetables for winter in the evenings, growing larger and more uncomfortable and refusing to acknowledge the discomfort in any way that would prompt someone to suggest she slow down. Ryder watched her do this with a mixture of admiration and a specific kind of worried helplessness that he had no real outlet for, because every time he gestured toward adjusting her workload, she looked at him with an expression that communicated clearly that this was her body and her decision, and his concern was noted and filed. He did the things he could do without making it a negotiation. He took over the water carry every morning without framing it as assistance. He fixed the loose step she'd been navigating for 2 weeks the day after he noticed her accounting for it in her stride. He drove into town and back for things that could have waited, because going into town gave her an hour to sit without anyone asking anything of her, and she sat in the wagon with the summer landscape moving past, and sometimes she closed her eyes and he said nothing. Pete, for his part, began doing things with the quiet efficiency of someone who had decided that efficiency was a form of care. The barn cleaning happened more regularly. The water trough nearest the house was never allowed to get below half. Tools were returned to where they belonged so that nobody had to search for them. Cobb began making sure there was always split wood on the porch. Nobody discussed any of this as a system. It simply operated, the way good systems do, without requiring acknowledgement to function. In July, a letter arrived from Philadelphia. It was addressed to Evelyn Blackwell, and it came from a woman named Frances Cole, who had been a fellow teacher at the academy where Evelyn had worked. Evelyn read it at the kitchen table on a hot afternoon with the windows open and the smell of dry grass coming in on the breeze. She read it twice. Then she folded it and sat for a long time. When Ryder came in from the afternoon work, she was still sitting there. "What is it?" he said. She handed him the letter. He read it. Frances Cole had written to tell Evelyn that Gerald Caldwell had been dismissed from the academy 2 months prior, following complaints from 3 other teachers. Complaints that had finally been taken seriously because they came in number, which single complaints never had been. The board had quietly removed him. There would be no public trial, no legal consequence. Frances was honest about that. But he was gone from the academy, gone from his position of authority. And the board, she wrote, was now conducting a review of dismissed teachers whose cases might be reconsidered. Ryder set the letter down. He looked at Evelyn. Her face was doing something complicated. Not tears. She was past the reflexive tears, had burned through them sometime over the winter. Replace them with something less demonstrative but more durable. It was the expression of a person receiving information that doesn't fix everything, but fixes the specific thing that broke first. They won't restore the certificate, she said. Her voice was level. Not from here. Not without a formal process and an advocate and time I'd have to spend back east. And I'm not spending it. She looked at the letter on the table. But he's gone. He's out of it. That matters, Ryder said. Yes. She was quiet. I thought it would feel bigger. When I imagined this, and I imagined it at the beginning, before I stopped letting myself, I thought it would feel like something broke open. She pressed her lips together. It just feels like something settled. Maybe that's what justice actually feels like, Ryder said. Not a door breaking, just a door closing. She looked at him. That's unusually philosophical for you. I have my moments. He sat down across from her. Are you all right? She thought about it, actually thought about it. Yes, she said. I think I genuinely am. She reached across the table and picked up the letter and folded it again, carefully, and put it in the small cedar box on the shelf where she kept the things that mattered. The ring she'd worn before, a drawing Clara Ames had made of her teacher, the wooden bird from Nora. The letter went in and the lid closed, and she turned back to the afternoon. The baby came on the 27th of September, which was a Thursday, in the middle of an early fall storm that was not as bad as the December one, but was bad enough that Nora, who had come out the week before and simply stayed because she was a woman who understood timing, had to work by lamplight. It was long. It was hard. Evelyn would not, afterward, dramatize it, but she also would not pretend it was something other than what it was, which was the most physically demanding thing she had ever done. And she had spent a winter on a working cattle ranch in Wyoming. Ryder was in the main room for most of it. Nora had been clear about jurisdictions. He sat in his chair, and he did not pace, because pacing would not have helped, and he was a man who did not do things that did not help. He sat and he listened to the sounds from the bedroom, and he held himself very still, the way he held himself still when something large and uncontrollable was happening, and there was nothing to do but be present for the outcome. Pete was on the porch. He said he needed air. He'd been on the porch for 4 hours. Cobb had ridden to town at 2 in the afternoon to get the doctor as a precaution. He arrived with the doctor at 6, and Nora let the doctor in, assessed him in 30 seconds, and assigned him a specific supportive role while making clear that she had the situation. The doctor, who was a practical man, accepted this. The boy was born at 8:30 in the evening. He made his opinion of the world known immediately and at volume, which Nora said was an excellent sign, and the doctor agreed, and Evelyn, exhausted in a way that went past language, flat on her back with sweat in her hair, and her whole body feeling like it had been disassembled and roughly put back together, laughed. A short, raw, involuntary laugh that turned into something else at the edges, but held. Ryder came in when Nora opened the door. He stood at the bedside and looked at Evelyn first. She looked back at him, wrecked and present and more herself, somehow, than he had ever seen her, as if the extremity of the evening had stripped off the last layer of management and left just the actual person beneath it. I'm fine, she said, before he could ask. I can see that. His voice was different, rough at the edges. He's healthy. Look. He looked at the baby in her arms. He had prepared himself, intellectually, for this moment, had told himself it would be significant, and tried to pre-account for the significance so it wouldn't undo him. This had been foolish, he now understood. There was no pre-accounting for it. It simply arrived and took whatever space it needed. He sat on the edge of the bed. Evelyn moved the baby slightly toward him, a small offering, and he put out a hand, a big hand, roughened from 20 years of ranch work. And the baby's fingers closed around one of his, reflexively, with a grip that was both completely instinctive and absolutely deliberate feeling. Something in Ryder Blackwell's face broke open and then resettled into something new. Nora watched this from across the room and then quietly gathered her things and gave them the space, because this was a moment that belonged to the people in it. They named him James, not after anyone living, not a tribute or an obligation, just a name they both said aloud, and looked at each other and knew was right, the way you sometimes know something without a process. James Marcus Blackwell, for the middle name. For Marcus, who had worked this land and moved away and sent a letter when he heard, a letter that was not eloquent but was genuine, saying he was glad the ranch was still in the family and glad his brother had found something worth staying for. The first weeks were the weeks that nobody talks about honestly enough. The weeks of no sleep and radical uncertainty, and the discovery that a person who believes themselves competent can be completely destabilized by a being who weighs 8 pounds and communicates exclusively through volume. Evelyn, who had managed a classroom of 13 children across 5 grade levels, who had faced down a town council and a man who tried to destroy her, sat in the rocking chair at 3 in the morning with a baby who would not be comforted and felt, for the first time in years, entirely at a loss. Ryder got up. He always got up, not every other night, every night, and took the baby and walked the main room while Evelyn slept. And when James finally settled, it was usually because Ryder had stopped trying to solve whatever the crying was about, and had just held him and walked, steady and quiet, the way Ryder was steady and quiet, and apparently that was enough. "You're better at this than I am," Evelyn said once, at 4 in the morning, taking the sleeping baby back. "You're better at the parts that matter more," he said. "Which parts are those?" "The ones that come later." He looked at James asleep against her shoulder. "The parts that make a person who they're going to be. That's your work." He paused. "I can do the walking." She looked at him standing there in the low lamplight, hair unsettled from sleep, eyes carrying the same tiredness she felt in every part of herself. Not the romantic version of any of this. Not handsome by the lamplight, not making a speech. Just a man being honest about what he could give and what he trusted her with. She thought about who she'd been when she stepped off that stagecoach a year ago. The woman who had held herself together for the last mile of the journey and failed to hold it for the last 50 feet. The woman who had arrived with one trunk and no expectations, and the specific despair of someone who has had everything taken and doesn't yet know if they have anything left to rebuild with. She had rebuilt with what was left. Turns out there was more left than Caldwell had intended to take. By the time James was 3 months old, the school had formally received its territorial designation. The letter from the Wyoming Board of Education arrived on a Tuesday, and Walt Greer read it out in the feed store to whoever happened to be present, which was several people, and the news moved through Willow Ridge in the way good news moved through a small town, faster than bad news, but with more staying power. Evelyn read the official document at the kitchen table that evening, while James slept in the small crib that Pete had built. No announcement, just appeared in the house one morning, sanded smooth, a piece of good, careful work that Pete had decided needed doing and done. She read the letter and set it down and looked out the window at the November afternoon, the fields turning their autumn color, the cottonwoods dropping their yellow leaves along the creek. Ryder sat down across from her. "Territorial designation," she said. "I heard from Walt. It means funding. It means I can hire an assistant teacher next year. It means—" She stopped. "It means it's real in the way that a document from a government makes a thing real, which is a different kind of real from the other kind." "You already knew it was real," he said. "I knew it was real. Now Pharaoh knows it's real." She met his eyes. "He can't dissolve it now. It's not a town council vote anymore. It's a territorial institution. Even if he bought the building tomorrow, the school would have legal standing to demand accommodation. He won't buy the building. It's not worth the political cost anymore." "No," she agreed. "I think he's done with this particular fight." There was in her voice not triumph exactly. It was too tired for triumph and too clear-eyed. It was more like the satisfaction of a person who has carried something a long way and has finally been allowed to set it down somewhere solid. "What do you want to do with it?" Ryder asked. "The school, long-term." She thought about it seriously, the way she took seriously all questions that deserved it. "I want it to outlast me. I want it to be something that exists in this valley regardless of whether I'm running it. I want to train someone who can take it forward." She looked at the document. "Thomas Greer is 15. He's the best mind in that school. In 5 years, if someone's been developing him correctly, he could teach the younger children." She paused. "He wants to go to university eventually. I'm going to help him figure out how to get there." Ryder looked at her. "Walt's going to cry. Walt's going to be insufferably proud. There's a difference." Something moved in her face, the almost smile that over this year had been graduating incrementally toward the real thing. "I'm going to be insufferably proud too. I've earned it." "You have," he said, without qualification. She looked at him across the table. The lamp between them was low and warm. From the bedroom came the small sounds of James beginning to stir. Not crying yet, just the preliminary sounds of a person waking into the world and figuring out how they feel about it. In a moment, one of them would go. It would probably be Ryder, because he was closer and because he had developed, over 3 months, an uncanny ability to get to the baby before the situation escalated. But for this moment, they sat across from each other in the kitchen of the house that was theirs, both of theirs, legally and truly and in every way that mattered, on the land that was theirs, in the life that neither of them had planned and both of them had built. Evelyn thought about the woman on the stagecoach. She thought about this regularly, not with the ache it used to carry, but with the specific attention she brought to things she wanted to remember accurately. The woman on the stagecoach had been out of options and out of time, and had made one decision that she wasn't sure would hold: to go somewhere new and try to be someone she could still recognize. That was all the plan had been. That was the whole of it. She had not planned Ryder, had not planned the deed with her name on it, or the stove in the schoolroom, or Pete handing her his coffee cup and going back up the ladder, or Nora's carved bird on the windowsill, or December storms navigated together, or a baby in a crib that Pete built without being asked. She had not planned any of the specific shape of what her life had become, but she had planned to be honest. She had planned to work. She had planned to refuse to be defined by what Caldwell had done, to refuse to carry his verdict on her for the rest of her life. Those things she had planned, and they had been enough. Not to guarantee the outcome. Nothing guarantees outcomes. But to make her someone worth knowing when the right people were paying attention. That, she thought, was the actual lesson. Not that hard work is always rewarded, because it isn't. Not that truth defeats power, because it doesn't always. The lesson was narrower and more honest than those easy versions. That what you decide to be in the worst circumstances is the thing that either leaves you with something to build from or doesn't. Caldwell had taken almost everything she had. He hadn't been able to take who she was when the pressure was at its worst. She had been honest, and she had refused to collapse into something smaller than herself. And that had been the one thing he couldn't reach. She couldn't teach that to 13 children in a schoolroom. You can't teach it. You can only live it well enough that the people watching you learn the shape of it. James made a definitive sound from the bedroom. Ryder stood. He looked at her with the face she knew now, knew the map of it, the specific geography of his expressions, the ones he gave the room and the ones he saved for quiet moments in their kitchen. "I've got him," he said. "I know you do," she said. He went down the hall. She heard him, low voice, the particular tone he used with the baby that he used with no one else. Patient and easy and a little rough around the edges. The voice of a man who didn't know how to be gentle in a practiced way, but was finding out how to be genuine in his own. She heard James settle. She heard Ryder walk the slow circuit of the room the way he did, steady and quiet. Outside, the November wind moved through the cottonwoods and across the open fields of the Blackwell Ranch. 340 acres of good Wyoming land, bought with hard work and held by harder work, and now carrying, in the last year, something it hadn't carried before. Not just cattle and creek water and fence line, not just the weight of seasons and the memory of the people who had worked it. Something more than survival had taken root here. Something Ryder had stopped hoping for before he'd known to stop hoping. Something Evelyn had believed was finished for her, concluded, rendered impossible by one man's decision to punish her for refusing him. They were both wrong, as it turned out. Which is, if you are paying attention, one of the more useful things that can happen to a person. To be wrong in the direction of more rather than less. To discover that the walls you were certain you'd hit aren't walls at all, but the edge of something you hadn't seen yet. The wind went on. The house held. James slept, finally, in his father's arms. And Evelyn Blackwell sat in the kitchen of her life. The life she had arrived for in pieces.